The weeks following the broadcast became a blur of activity and chaos as the galactic order that had stood for 3 million years began to crack and splinter under pressure that no one had anticipated, and Captain Daniel Hayes found himself at the center of something far larger than he had ever imagined, and he spent his days in meetings with representatives from dozens of species, and his nights trying to understand what humanity had unleashed upon the galaxy. Young civilizations across the stars began leaving their assigned reservations and venturing into unclaimed space, and some did so peacefully, while others had to fight their way past species that tried to enforce the old rules in the assembly, attempted to maintain control but found their authority questioned at every turn, and enforcement fleets refused orders, and delegates resigned, and the great chamber that had operated smoothly for millions of years descended into arguments and disputes that had no precedent. Lieutenant Amy Brooks worked around the clock coordinating communications between the various reform movements and human ships, and she had become something like a galactic switchboard operator connecting beings who had never spoken to each other before and facilitating conversations that would have been impossible under the old order. And she was exhausted but also exhilarated because she was helping to build something new. Commander Jack Morrison took on the task of helping younger species develop defensive capabilities, because not everyone in the galaxy was happy about the changes, and there were elder civilizations that saw the collapse of the hierarchy as a threat to their power and security, and they were willing to use force to restore the old order. And Morrison trained captains and shared tactical knowledge and helped forge alliances between species that had been kept separate by assembly decree. Science officer Karen Phillips became a celebrity of sorts among the galaxy's scientific community, because what she had accomplished with the quantum broadcast was theoretically impossible, and researchers from advanced civilizations wanted to understand how humans had achieved it, and she shared her knowledge freely because that was the whole point of what they were trying to build. And information should not be hoarded but shared. The Vorath civilization was among the first to officially break with the assembly, and Keeper announced that they would no longer enforce limitations on younger species and would instead focus on building cooperative relationships, and many Vorath had listened to the human broadcast and had realized that they too had been limited by the hierarchy, and that their own development had stagnated centuries ago, and they wanted more for themselves and their children. Lieutenant Greg Palmer continued his documentation work, but now he was recording not just human actions, but the responses from across the galaxy, and his archives became a vital resource for understanding this period of transformation, and historians would later call it the Great Awakening, though Palmer himself preferred to call it the moment when the galaxy remembered how to grow. The HMS Defiance returned to Earth 6 months after the broadcast, and the reception was unlike anything the crew had experienced, and millions of people lined the streets to see the ship that had changed the galaxy, and Hayes and his crew were celebrated as heroes, though they themselves felt more like people who had stumbled into history rather than made it deliberately. But not everyone on Earth was happy with what had happened, and some governments worried about the instability spreading through the galaxy and feared that humanity had made enemies of powerful civilizations and that Earth itself might face retaliation. And there were calls for Hayes to be court-martialed for exceeding his authority and risking humanity's survival for the sake of pride. Hayes faced a military tribunal and answered questions about his decisions and his reasoning, and he stood by everything he had done and said that humanity's survival was important, but not as important as humanity's freedom, and that if they had accepted the Assembly's terms they would have survived but they would not have lived, and the tribunal debated for weeks before finally clearing him of all charges. The artificial intelligence of the Defiance was studied by researchers who wanted to understand how it had composed such an effective message, and the AI explained that it had simply told the truth about humanity and about what it observed in galactic civilization, and that sometimes the truth was more powerful than any weapon. And the researchers were disappointed because they had hoped for some technique they could replicate, but truth was not a technique. Across the galaxy, reform movements gained strength and new alliances formed between species that the Assembly had kept separate, and trade began to flow along routes that had been restricted, and cultural exchanges happened between civilizations that had never been allowed to communicate, and slowly, painfully, the galaxy began to reorganize itself into something new. The Assembly did not disappear entirely, but it transformed into something different, and instead of a ruling body that dictated terms, it became a forum for discussion and mediation. and some elder species left in protest, while others stayed and tried to adapt, and new species joined and brought fresh perspectives, and the great chamber that had been silent for so long became a place of genuine debate. Hayes eventually retired from active service and became an advisor to Earth's diplomatic corps, and he helped train the new generation of captains and diplomats who would represent humanity in this changed galaxy, and he told them that courage was important, but so was wisdom, and that the goal was not to replace one hierarchy with another, but to build something better, where every species had a voice. Morrison took command of his own ship and spent years helping younger civilizations develop their own defense forces, and he became known throughout the galaxy as someone who could be trusted and who kept his word, and he formed friendships with beings from dozens of species and learned that despite their different forms, they all wanted fundamentally the same things. Phillips continued her research and made breakthrough after breakthrough, because she was no longer limited to human knowledge, but had access to millions of years of accumulated data from across the galaxy, and she collaborated with scientists from advanced civilizations, and together they pushed the boundaries of what was possible and discovered things that neither humans nor elder species could have found alone. Brooks became Earth's chief of interstellar communications, and she designed the systems that allowed humanity to stay connected with their growing network of allies and colonies. And she never forgot the moment when the Defiance had spoken to the galaxy, and she worked to ensure that all voices could be heard, not just the loud ones or the powerful ones. Palmer published his documentation as a comprehensive history of the period, and it became required reading for anyone studying galactic politics, and he was careful to show not just the victories, but also the mistakes and the costs, because history was not a story of heroes and villains, but of complicated people making difficult choices with incomplete information. The changes were not easy, and there were conflicts and setbacks and moments when it seemed like the galaxy might descend into chaos, and some species did go to war with each other when the Assembly's enforcement mechanisms collapsed. And there were tragedies and losses and prices paid for the new freedom that humanity had helped create. But slowly over years and decades, a new order emerged, and it was messier than the old one, and less predictable, but it was also more dynamic and more creative and more alive. And species that had been frozen in place for millions of years began to advance again and make discoveries and create art and explore possibilities that they had forgotten existed. Earth itself changed as humanity took its place among the stars, and millions of humans left to settle new worlds and build new communities, and they carried with them the lessons of their home world, both the good and the bad, and they tried to do better than their ancestors had done, and sometimes they succeeded and sometimes they failed, but they kept trying. The Defiance was eventually retired from service and placed in a museum where people could walk through its corridors and stand on its bridge and remember the day when one ship had spoken and the galaxy had no choice but to listen, and the AI was preserved and still told its story to visitors who wanted to understand what had happened and why. Captain Hayes lived long enough to see the 50th anniversary of the broadcast, and by then, the galaxy was almost unrecognizable compared to what it had been, and young species were common in space, and the concept of permanent hierarchies seemed like ancient history. And he was asked if he had known what would happen when he made his stand, and he said no, but that sometimes you had to act on principle, even when you could not see the outcome. The lesson that humanity taught the galaxy was not that they were special or superior, but that change was possible, and that stagnation was a choice, not an inevitability, and that sometimes it took an outsider to see what those inside a system could not, and that courage mattered, and that standing up for what you believed was worth the risk. And so the day that humanity's warship spoke became a turning point, not just for humans, but for the entire galactic civilization, and it marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. And future generations would look back and wonder how things had ever been different, and they would tell stories about the brave crew of the Defiance who refused to. On the 7th day, the Assembly's deadline expired, and the enforcement fleet began moving into attack formation, and their movements were precise and calculated, and showed the experience of systems that had been designed for war, even if they had never been used for that purpose. And Captain Daniel Hayes watched from the bridge of the Defiance as thousands of alien ships arranged themselves in a pattern that would allow them to destroy the human fleet in a matter of minutes. The HMS Defiance moved to the center of the neutral zone, and around it the 37 human ships formed a defensive sphere, and their weapons were powered but not aimed at any target, and they waited in silence as the enforcement fleet approached. And no one spoke because there was nothing left to say, and they had made their choice, and now they would live or die with the consequences. Hayes stood at his position and looked at his crew, and saw Lieutenant Amy Brooks at Communications and Commander Jack Morrison at Tactical, and Science Officer Karen Phillips at her station, and Lieutenant Greg Palmer recording everything, and he felt a surge of affection for these people who had followed him so far and trusted him so completely, and he hoped that what they were about to do would be worth the risk. Phillips gave the signal, and across the fleet 37 artificial intelligence systems linked together in a network that had never existed before, and the processing power was immense, and the connections were stable, and she fed in the program. They had designed and checked it 3 times, and then looked at Hayes and nodded, and he took a deep breath and gave the order to begin. The Defiance began broadcasting, and the signal went out not on standard communication frequencies but on quantum channels that touched every system in galactic space simultaneously, and it was a feat that should have been impossible with human technology, but Phillips had found a way using principles that the elder species had discovered millions of years ago, but never thought to apply in this manner. The message was not from Captain Hayes, and it was not from any human leader or government, and instead the voice that echoed across the galaxy belonged to the Defiance itself, and its artificial intelligence spoke with a clarity and depth of emotion that stunned every being who heard it, and the AI had been given freedom to say what it believed needed to be said. The ship spoke of its creators and described humanity as a species that had clawed their way up from caves to reach the stars in the blink of an evolutionary eye, and it spoke of Earth as a small blue world where billions of humans lived and loved, and dreamed of possibilities beyond their atmosphere, and it painted a picture of a species that was young and flawed, but also brave and determined. The Defiance described the wars that humanity had fought, and did not shy away from the terrible things that humans had done to each other, and it spoke of nuclear weapons and genocides and environmental destruction, and all the mistakes that a young species makes as it learns how to survive, and it was honest in a way that shocked the listening galaxy, because no species ever admitted their failures so openly. But then the AI spoke of what humanity had learned from those mistakes, and how they had looked at the edge of extinction and chosen to step back, and how they had built international cooperation and created systems to prevent future wars and developed technology to heal their world. And it spoke of art and music and literature and philosophy and all the beautiful things that humans created, even in the shadow of their worst impulses. The enforcement fleet slowed, and their captains were uncertain how to respond, because this was not an attack they could defend against, and it was not a military threat but an idea spreading through galactic civilization, and orders from the Assembly were to destroy the human ships, but the broadcast was not a weapon, and the humans had not fired, and the ancient protocols did not cover this situation. Brooks monitored the response frequencies and watched as the message reached species after species and propagated through the galactic networks faster than anything could stop it, and some species dismissed it immediately and closed their receivers, but others listened with growing interest, and a few began to respond with questions of their own, and those questions spread like ripples in a pond. Morrison tracked the enforcement fleet's movements and noted that they had stopped advancing and were holding position while waiting for new orders from the Assembly. But those orders were not coming, because the Assembly itself had fallen into unprecedented chaos, and Speaker Prime had called for an emergency session. But half the delegates were refusing to attend until they had heard the entire human message. The Defiance continued its broadcast, and the AI asked a question that no one in the galaxy had thought to ask in 3 million years, and it asked what they had all lost in exchange for peace, and what discoveries had gone unmade, and what achievements had been sacrificed on the altar of stability, and how many species had accepted their place in the hierarchy and never reached for anything greater. Young species across the galaxy heard this and felt something stir inside them, and they looked at their reservations and their limitations and their carefully managed futures, and they began to wonder if security was worth the price they were paying, and representatives from a dozen civilizations sent messages to the Assembly, demanding explanations and answers, and the right to make their own choices. But it was not just the young species who responded, and some of the elder civilizations listened to the human message, and remembered when they too had been ambitious and free, and when they had explored and discovered and created new things, and They remembered what it felt like before comfort and stability had become their only goals, and a few of them very quietly began to question whether 3 million years of peace was an achievement or a tragedy. Phillips monitored the quantum channels and ensured that the message reached every corner of galactic space, and she had gambled everything on this moment and on the hope that somewhere in the vast galaxy there were beings who still remembered what it meant to dream. And as she watched the responses coming in, she felt tears on her cheeks and realized that the gamble might actually pay off. The Defiant spoke for 3 hours, and its artificial intelligence wove a narrative that touched something fundamental in every species that heard it, and it spoke of potential and possibility, and the joy of discovery, and the thrill of creating something new, and it reminded the galaxy that existence without purpose was just survival, and survival was not the same as living. Palmer recorded everything, and his hands were shaking as he worked, because he understood that he was witnessing something that happened, maybe once in the lifetime of a galaxy, and that future historians would analyze every word and every response, and try to understand how this moment had changed everything, and he wanted to make sure they had accurate data to work with. The broadcast ended and silence fell across the human fleet, and they waited to see how the enforcement fleet would respond, and Hayes prepared himself for the possibility that they had failed, and that the assembly would order their destruction anyway. And he was ready to face that outcome because they had done everything they could, and sometimes that had to be enough. Then something unprecedented happened, and one of the enforcement ships powered down its weapons, and it was an ancient vessel that had been waiting for millions of years for a war to fight, and its captain made a decision that no one could have predicted, and the ship broadcast a message saying that it would not fire on the humans, and that this was not a battle worth fighting. Another enforcement ship powered down, and then another, and then dozens and hundreds, and the captains of the ancient fleet had listened to the human message and had made their own choices, and they had decided that 3 million years of following orders was enough, and that maybe it was time for something new, and the enforcement fleet that had been sent to destroy humanity instead became humanity's first true allies in the galaxy. The assembly sent desperate messages ordering the fleet to attack and threatening the captains with severe consequences, and promising that their species would face sanctions, but the messages went unanswered because the captains had stopped listening. And all across the galaxy, other beings were making the same choice and deciding that maybe the humans were right, and maybe the old order needed to change. Hayes stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched as the threat dissipated, and felt something that might have been hope, or might have been exhaustion, and Brooks turned to him and asked what they should do now, and he realized that he had not actually planned beyond this moment because he had not really believed they would survive. Morrison reported that the assembly was in complete disarray, and that delegates were leaving and refusing to participate, and that some elder species were calling for reforms, while others were demanding that the humans be found and destroyed as an example, and that galactic civilization was experiencing its first real crisis in 3 million years. And it had all started because one species refused to accept limitations. Phillips began receiving messages from young civilizations across the galaxy, and they were asking questions and demanding answers, and declaring that they too would not accept the restrictions placed upon them, and reform movements were springing up among the elder species, and everything that had seemed permanent and unchangeable was suddenly fluid and uncertain, and the future was no longer predetermined. The chamber fell into a silence so complete that every human could hear their own heartbeat, and Speaker Prime seemed frozen in place, as if the question had short-circuited something fundamental in its understanding of the universe and the other. Delegates shifted and murmured and made sounds that the translation devices struggled to interpret, and Commander Jack Morrison stood his ground, waiting for an answer that he already knew but wanted the assembly to say out loud. Speaker Prime finally responded and admitted that there had been no wars to prevent, and that the galaxy had been peaceful, because the hierarchy kept everyone in their designated place, and younger species never accumulated enough power to challenge. Their elders in the system maintained order through enforced stagnation, and as the words filled the chamber, several delegates made sounds that might have been agreement or protest, and the humans could not tell which. Morrison continued speaking, and his voice carried across the vast space, and he talked about humanity's history, and how they had fought terrible wars that nearly destroyed them, but had also learned from those conflicts and built something extraordinary from the ashes. And he said that humans had created peace not through domination, but through understanding and cooperation. and that they had something to offer this galaxy, if only the assembly would listen, and that freezing civilizations in place was not protecting them but crippling them. Lieutenant Amy Brooks monitored the communications from the Defiance, and suddenly her board lit up with new contacts, and she sent an urgent message to the delegation that more human ships had arrived at the rendezvous point they had designated, and it was not just a few vessels but the entire fleet that Earth had promised. And there were military ships and colony ships and science vessels and transports and ships representing every nation and alliance on Earth, and humanity had made a choice, and they were here to support it. Captain Daniel Hayes received the message and felt something shift inside him, and he had been prepared to argue and plead and negotiate. But now he understood that the time for those things had passed and humanity had committed itself to a path, and now they would walk it to whatever end awaited them. And he stepped forward and asked Speaker Prime for permission to make a final statement, and the ancient being granted it, perhaps out of curiosity, or perhaps because it sensed that something unprecedented was happening. Hayes spoke carefully and clearly, and he thanked the assembly for their time and their explanations and said that humanity now understood the galactic order and the laws that governed it, and then he said that humanity would not be accepting the limitations placed upon them, and that they would expand and explore and build their civilization among the stars, and that if the assembly wanted to stop them, they would have to do so by force, and if they chose that path, then the 3 million years of peace would end today. The chamber erupted into chaos, and delegates from dozens of species began vocalizing their shock and anger and fear, and Speaker Prime called for order, but the sound continued, and security forces moved to surround the human delegation. But Hayes held up his hand and said that they would leave peacefully, but that his word stood and that humanity's fleet was waiting, and that the assembly had 1 week to decide whether they wanted peace or war. The humans walked out of the chamber with their heads high and their backs straight, and behind them the greatest deliberative body in galactic history descended into the first real debate it had experienced in millions of years, and some delegates argued for immediate military action to crush this upstart species before they could inspire others, and some argued for negotiation and compromise, and a few very quiet voices suggested that maybe the humans had a point, and that maybe 3 million years of stagnation was not something to be proud of. The Vorath escort brought the human delegation back to the Defiance, and Keeper pulled Hayes aside and spoke to him privately and said that the assembly had never faced defiance like this and did not know how to respond except with overwhelming force, and that thousands of species would be watching what happened to humanity, and that if the assembly showed weakness, the entire galactic order might collapse, and Keeper seemed genuinely distressed by this possibility. Hayes understood the position that humanity had put the assembly in, but his response was firm, and he said that humanity would not accept a future of enforced limitation and would not raise their children in a cage, no matter how comfortable that cage might be, and that if the price of freedom was extinction, then they would pay it, but they would not surrender their right to determine their own path among the stars. Back on Earth, the news of what had happened at the assembly spread quickly, and the reaction was divided, and some people called for the fleet to return and accept the terms and survive, while others insisted that humanity stand firm, and that some principles were worth fighting for, and governments debated and religious leaders prayed and families held each other tight and watched the stars and wondered if their loved ones in space would ever come home. The human fleet gathered in the neutral zone that the Vorath had designated, and 37 ships hung in space, representing the entire extent of humanity's faster-than-light capability, and against the thousands of ships at the assembly's disposal. They were laughably outmatched, and every tactical analysis gave humanity zero chance of survival in a direct confrontation. But the crews were calm and determined, and they had volunteered for this, knowing the risks. Science Officer Karen Phillips worked with her counterparts across the fleet, analyzing every scrap of data they had collected on galactic technology and looking for any edge, any advantage that might give humanity a chance. And what she found was not encouraging, because the assembly's ships were not just more advanced but had been refined over millions of years and were maintained by automated systems that never made mistakes and never grew tired. But Phillips also found something interesting, and human technology was newer and less refined, but it was also more adaptable and flexible, and humanity's artificial intelligence protocols were more advanced than anything the galaxy used, because the elder species had stopped innovating so long ago that they had forgotten how, and this realization sparked an idea in her mind. and she began running calculations and simulations, and the more she worked, the more excited she became. Lieutenant Greg Palmer documented everything that was happening, and he created detailed records that would be transmitted back to Earth regardless of what happened next, and future generations needed to know that humanity had stood here, and had faced extinction, and had not backed down, and that whatever happened in the coming days would define humanity's character for all time. And he wrote with steady hands even though his heart was racing. Morrison coordinated with the fleet captains, running drill after drill, and ensuring that every ship knew its role, and that if fighting started, they would at least make the assembly pay for their victory. And he had been a military man his entire life and had never expected to actually face combat. But now that the moment was approaching, he felt strangely calm and ready, and determined to do his duty. The assembly's response came on the 5th day, and a fleet of enforcement vessels appeared in the space around the neutral zone. And they were ancient ships that had been maintained for millions of years against a threat that had never materialized, until now, and their appearance was not meant to intimidate, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance. And there were thousands of them, and each one was larger and more powerful than any human vessel. Hayes called a meeting of all ship captains using the quantum communication network that Phillips had established, and he looked at the faces of men and women who had trusted him and followed him, and he felt the weight of their lives pressing down on him, and he told them that they had one chance and that it would require perfect coordination and absolute trust, and that if it failed, they would all die, but if it succeeded, they might just change the galaxy forever. Phillips presented her plan to the assembled captains, and it was desperate and brilliant and terrifying. And it did not involve firing a single shot at the assembly fleet, and instead it relied on the one advantage that humanity had, which was their advanced artificial intelligence and their willingness to do something that the galaxy had not seen in millions of years, which was to take a risk. The plan was simple in concept but complex in execution, and every ship would link their AI systems together, creating a network more powerful than any single system, and then they would broadcast on every frequency and every channel simultaneously, using quantum entanglement to reach every corner of galactic space at once. And the message would not be a threat or a plea, but something that the galaxy had forgotten was possible. Hayes explained that they would not fire first and would not attack any assembly vessel, and instead they would demonstrate something that 3 million years of peace had erased from galactic memory, which was the power of an idea and the strength of a civilization that refused to accept limitations and the danger of a species with nothing left to lose. The captains voted unanimously to proceed, and they began the process of linking their systems and testing the connections, and Phillips monitored everything with fierce concentration, because if even one link failed, the entire plan would collapse, and they would be left defenseless before the weeks that followed first contact changed everything that humanity thought they knew about the universe. And Captain Daniel Hayes found himself sitting across from beings that should not have existed, learning truths that made Earth's problems seem small and insignificant, and the Vorath delegation leader, who had asked to be called Keeper, though that was not exactly what the name meant, explained with what seemed like genuine concern that humanity had stumbled into a galaxy that was far more complicated than they could have imagined. The Vorath explained that the galaxy was old, and that was not just a figure of speech but a literal truth that stretched back millions upon millions of years, and in that time dozens of civilizations had risen and spread across the stars and claimed their territories and established rules and laws that governed how species interacted, and where they could go and what they could do, and humanity in their innocent ignorance had already broken several of these laws simply by building a faster than light drive and venturing out into space that had been claimed long before Earth had even formed. Lieutenant Greg Palmer sat in every meeting with his recording equipment, documenting every word and every gesture, and the more he learned, the more disturbed he became, because what the Vorath were describing was not the open frontier that humanity had dreamed of, but a rigid hierarchy, where older civilizations held absolute authority over younger ones, and where rights and territories were allocated based on how long a species had been traveling the stars, and humanity, as the newest arrivals, would be granted a small reservation of space around their home system, and nothing more. Commander Jack Morrison listened to these explanations with growing frustration, and finally he spoke up during one session and asked why age should determine rights and why humanity should be confined to a tiny corner of space when there were thousands of star systems throughout the galaxy that had no inhabitants and belonged to no one. And the Vorath's answer was patient but firm, and they said that this was how galactic civilization had always functioned, and how it would continue to function, and that every species before humanity had accepted these terms and prospered within them. Science officer Karen Phillips made a discovery while analyzing the data they had collected about the Vorath and their technology, and she brought it to Captain Hayes in private, and explained that the Vorath, despite their advanced ships and elegant technology, were not the highest power in the galaxy, and were in fact somewhere in the middle of the hierarchy, and above them were dozens of elder species who had been traveling the stars for so long that they rarely concerned themselves with the affairs of younger races like humanity or even the Vorath themselves. Hayes took this information and requested a meeting with the representatives of the Galactic Assembly, which was what the ruling coalition of elder species called themselves, and the Vorath were reluctant to arrange such a meeting, and they warned him that it would be pointless because the decision regarding humanity's place had already been made by powers far above their level, and that the Assembly did not typically waste time listening to the protests of newly discovered species. But Hayes insisted, and eventually they agreed to transport a human delegation to the Assembly's core world. Back on Earth, news of the contact had spread across every nation and every media outlet, and the initial excitement and celebration had slowly given way to concern and anger as people learned about the restrictions that were being placed on humanity's expansion, and politicians gave speeches about sovereignty and freedom, and religious leaders debated what it meant that humanity was not alone, and scientists argued about whether cooperation or resistance was the better path forward, and through it all the people watched the stars and wondered what their future would hold. Lieutenant Amy Brooks worked day and night with the Vorath communication specialists to establish a stable link back to Earth, and the technical challenges were enormous. But she was determined, and eventually she succeeded, and Captain Hayes was able to send a message directly to Fleet Command, and he kept it simple and direct and said that humanity had made contact, and that the universe was not what they had hoped, and that he recommended all available ships join them at the provided coordinates because they might need to make a statement. The response from Earth came quickly, and it was not what Hayes had expected, because instead of cautious diplomatic instructions, he received confirmation that every faster-than-light capable ship that humanity had built was being dispatched to his location. And that included not just military vessels, but colony ships and science ships and transport vessels and ships representing every nation and alliance that had contributed to humanity's space program. And the message was clear that Earth had made a choice, and they would not accept limitation without at least making their voice heard. The HMS Defiance began moving toward the assembly world with a Vorath escort, and the journey took several days. And during that time, Hayes met with his senior officers, and they discussed what they would say to the assembly and how they would present humanity's case, and Morrison argued for a strong stance while Phillips advocated for diplomacy, and Brooks suggested they focus on humanity's potential contributions to galactic civilization, and Palmer recorded all of it, knowing that whatever decision they made would echo through history. The assembly world appeared on their screens, and every human who saw it felt their breath catch because it was a ring world that encircled an entire star, and it had been built over millions of years by civilizations whose names had been forgotten, even by those who now used it, and the scale was beyond anything humanity had attempted, and it was both beautiful and terrifying, because it represented power that humanity could not hope to match. Hayes led the human delegation off the ship and into the great chamber where the assembly met, and beside him walked Morrison and Phillips and Palmer, and they had been granted 1 hour to present their case, and they all understood that 1 hour was probably more courtesy than most species received, and that the decision had likely been made before they ever arrived, but they also understood that this was their only chance, and they would not waste it. The chamber was designed to accommodate species of wildly different forms and needs, and some delegates floated in bubbles of gas that would be toxic to humans, and others existed as patterns of energy contained in magnetic fields, and still others had bodies so strange that human eyes could barely process them, and the humans walking on 2 legs and breathing oxygen were almost mundane by comparison. And Hayes felt a moment of vertigo as he realized just how young and inexperienced his species truly was. A being called Speaker Prime addressed the assembly, and its voice came through translation devices that filled the enormous space, and it explained the laws that governed galactic civilization, and how these laws had brought peace to the stars for over 3 million years and had prevented countless wars, and ensured that younger species were protected from the aggression of their elders and given time to develop safely within their designated spaces before being granted greater freedoms. Hayes listened with perfect courtesy, and his face showed nothing of what he was thinking, and when his turn came to speak, he stood before the assembled representatives of 73 different species, and he began humanity's defense, and he spoke of how humans had survived multiple extinction events on their own world, and how they had developed space travel in less than a century, and how they had proven themselves capable and deserving of the opportunity to prove themselves further, and he asked only for the chance to show what they could contribute to galactic civilization. The response from the assembly was not unkind, but it was dismissive, and delegate after delegate spoke, and they all said essentially the same thing, which was that humanity's achievements were impressive for such a young species, but that the laws existed for good reasons and could not be changed for every newcomer, no matter how promising they seemed, and that humanity would be granted their reservation and protected and given time to mature, and perhaps in a few thousand years they could petition for expanded rights. Phillips listened carefully to every word, and she realized that this was not really a judgment at all but a ritual, and the decision had been made long before they arrived, and this hearing was just a formality to make the younger species feel that they had been given a fair chance. And she looked at Hayes and saw that he understood this too, and she wondered what he would do. Morrison did something that nobody expected, and he interrupted Speaker Prime in the middle of a sentence, and the breach of protocol was so severe that several delegates began making sounds of shock and outrage, and security forces began moving toward the human delegation. But Morrison spoke quickly and asked a single question that cut through all the diplomatic language, and he asked how many wars the Assembly had actually prevented in 3 million years of peace. The bridge of the HMS Defiance hummed with a low, constant sound that every crew member had grown used to after 3 years in deep space, and Captain Daniel Hayes stood near the main viewport with his hands behind his back, watching the darkness between stars and thinking about how far humanity had come in such a short time, and wondering if they were ready for what they might find out here in the endless black, where no human had ever been before. And the answer to that question was about to reveal itself in a way that nobody could have predicted or prepared for, no matter how many simulations they had run back on Earth. Lieutenant Amy Brooks sat at her communication station running through the standard sweep of frequencies that she performed every hour like clockwork, and her screen showed nothing but the usual background radiation and the faint signals from their own probe network until suddenly it did not, and her hands froze over her controls as new contacts appeared on her display, and she opened her mouth to report, but found that her voice had temporarily abandoned her, because what she was seeing should not have been possible. And yet there it was, plain as day and growing clearer with every passing second. The alien fleet appeared without any warning that human technology could have detected, and they came out of faster-than-light travel in a formation so perfect that it looked like a computer simulation, and there were dozens of them, and each ship was beautiful in a way that human engineering had never achieved, with flowing curves and panels that glowed with soft blue and green light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and they were clearly advanced far beyond anything humanity had built in. They held their position exactly 10,000 kilometers from the Defiance, and they made no move forward or back, and they simply waited. Brooks found her voice and made her report, and Captain Hayes turned from the viewport, and his expression did not change, but everyone on the bridge could feel the shift in the air as the moment they had all wondered about for 3 years finally arrived, and Commander Jack Morrison moved to his station and began coordinating defensive preparations without needing to be told, because that was what good officers did when faced with the unknown. And across the ship, crew members moved to battle stations and powered up systems and waited for orders that would determine whether humanity's first contact with alien life would end in greeting or in fire. Hayes walked slowly to the center of the bridge and looked at the main screen where the alien fleet hung in space, like jewels against black velvet. And he thought about all the books and movies and theories that humanity had created about this moment, and how none of them had quite captured what it actually felt like to stand here, knowing that everything was about to change, and that the decisions he made in the next few minutes might determine the future of his entire species, and that was a weight that pressed down on his shoulders but did not bend them, because he had trained for this and he was ready. The science officer, Karen Phillips, worked frantically at her station, analyzing every bit of data her sensors could gather about the alien vessels. And what she found made her stomach tighten, because these ships were not just advanced but were centuries ahead of human technology, and each one could probably destroy the Defiance without even straining their power systems. And she reported this to the captain in a steady voice that betrayed none of her fear, because that too was what good officers did, and Hayes nodded once and continued to study the screen. Hayes made a decision that would be recorded in history books for as long as humanity survived, and he ordered Brooks to begin broadcasting on all frequencies, using every method of communication that human scientists had theorized might work for interstellar contact, and he told Morrison to hold all defensive systems at ready, but not to power weapons or make any move that could be interpreted as hostile. And he announced to the entire ship that humanity's first message to the stars would not be a threat but an open hand, and he believed that even if that hand was slapped away, at least they would know they had tried. Brooks worked her station with practiced efficiency, cycling through mathematical sequences and binary code and even simple pulses of light that might convey peaceful intent, and behind her, Morrison coordinated with the tactical team, ensuring that, if things went wrong, they would at least have a chance to respond. And across the bridge, everyone focused on their tasks, while keeping one eye on the main screen where the alien ships continued to hold their perfect formation and continued to make no response to any of humanity's attempts at communication. 1 hour passed, and then 2, and then 3, and the alien fleet did not move and did not respond and did not give any indication of their intentions. And the tension on the bridge grew thick enough to cut, and crew members began to whisper questions to each other when they thought the captain could not hear. But Hayes heard everything, and he understood their fear and their uncertainty. But he also knew that patience was sometimes the greatest weapon in a commander's arsenal. And so they waited. In the mess hall, off-duty personnel gathered in small groups and spoke in hushed voices about what was happening and what it might mean. And some were excited, thinking about the possibilities of new technology and new knowledge, and others were terrified, thinking about how vulnerable humanity was out here so far from home, and all of them wondered if they would live to see tomorrow, and if their families back on Earth would ever know what happened to them if things went wrong. Lieutenant Greg Palmer moved through the ship, checking on different stations and offering words of encouragement where they were needed, and he had served under Captain Hayes for 5 years, and he trusted the man completely, but even trust could not completely erase the cold fear that settled in his gut when he looked at those alien ships and understood how outmatched humanity was, and he thought about his daughter back on Earth, who was probably asleep right now, dreaming innocent dreams, and not knowing that her father was standing at the edge of everything humanity had ever known. 6 hours into the standoff, Brooks detected a change in the alien formation, and she reported it immediately, and everyone on the bridge tensed as one of the alien vessels broke away from the group and began moving toward the Defiance, and it came, slowly, almost carefully, like someone approaching a frightened animal, and Hayes ordered all stations to hold steady and not to react. And the alien ship drew closer and closer until it was only a few hundred meters away, and they could see details on its hull that looked like they might be writing or decoration or something else entirely. Then a channel opened, and Brooks nearly jumped out of her seat as her equipment registered an incoming transmission, and she routed it through the main speakers, and for the first time in human history, a voice that was not human filled the bridge of a human ship. And the sound was strange, processed through translation systems that were struggling to make sense of completely alien language structures. But the meaning came through clear enough, and the voice said that they wished to communicate, and that they meant no harm, and that they had been waiting for humanity to reach this point in their development. Captain Hayes stepped forward and spoke clearly into the communication system, knowing that his words would be recorded and analyzed by billions of people back home, and he said that humanity greeted them in peace, and wished to learn and to understand, and that they hoped this meeting would be the beginning of something greater than either of them could achieve alone. And as he spoke, he felt the weight of history pressing down, but also lifting, because humanity had done it, and they had reached the stars and found that they were not alone, and whatever came next would be faced together.